Brethren, I have a question for you this afternoon. Are you bored with the basics? Now, we live in a society that's very fast-paced. A lot of people are virtually addicted to excitement. We've got all sorts of entertainment that is out there to capture the attention of all of us, young and old. There's a virtual entertainment and adventure industry that has all sorts of things. A lot of the teachers face the fact that when the children come to school, they have trouble keeping their attention. It's harder and harder to keep their attention because they have very short attention spans. They are tuned in to all of the exciting things and all of the very quick things that happen by way of television. Even the music is geared toward, frankly, away from contemplation, away from thinking, away from being thoughtful, and to creating a very short attention span that is just sort of here and there and everywhere. Now, the fact of people getting bored is not some new thing. That's not something that's just a characteristic of our time and our age. There has always been a tendency of human beings to get bored with things that are continuing on, that they have to go through on a day-in and day-out basis. You can read back in the book of Acts chapter 17 of a society that had a lot of boredom. People got tired of the basics. In fact, we read in Acts chapter 17 that, beginning in verse 15, that Paul was brought unto Athens. He was brought there, and Paul, verse 16, waited for his companions there in Athens, and he saw that the city was wholly given to idolatry. There were idols everywhere. The whole place was just caught up in it. And so he took advantage of the opportunity he had to speak in the synagogue, and there were some philosophers, because Athens was filled with philosophers. These particular two different schools of the philosophers, the Epicureans and the Stoics, and they heard about Paul, and they said, some said, this is in verse 18, "What will this babbler say?" And others say, "Well, you know, he seems to be a setter forth of strange gods. You know, he's got some new religion. He's teaching about other gods." So they took him and brought him unto the Areopagus. Mars Hill is translated in some places. That's what the word Areopagus means. Say, "May we know what is this new doctrine whereof you speak? You bring certain strange things to our ears, and we would know, therefore, what these things mean." Verse 21, "For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing." They spent their whole time in search of something new. They were easily bored with what they had. They were bored with the basics. They were searching for some new thing. And they spent all their time discussing new ideas and looking for new things. They became bored with what they had. And down through time, this is, of course, one of the things that has happened over and over to the people of God, is they have become bored with the basics and have become curious, and they have sort of wandered off, looking over here, looking over there, searching somewhere else, have gotten away from what is basic and what is fundamental. You know, we're told in 2 Timothy chapter 3, the Apostle Paul speaks of those that he characterizes in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7 as ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Ever learning, never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. They're always out pursuing this, pursuing that, pursuing something else, but they never stick to the basics and really come to know and to understand and to put into practice in their lives the truth of God. The truth of God is not simply something you write on a piece of paper or have on something that you just hang up on the wall and you can look at it, point to it, or have it in a book somewhere, point to it and say, yeah, that's the truth. Well, the truth may be contained, it's certainly contained in this book, the Bible, and there are books that are written that certainly have aspects of the truth and that focus in on the truth in certain areas. That's all well and good, but the truth is not something to simply be a matter of debate. The truth is not simply designed to be a matter of academic interest. The truth is designed to be something that we live, something that is a part of us, something that reflects itself in the way we live and act and do. But we find that the Athenians were always wanting to hear some new thing. They got tired of the things that they had. Of course, they were forever pursuing. They were chasing, sort of like the pursuit of happiness. As long as you're pursuing it, trying to find somebody or something to make you happy, you will spend your life in pursuit. You know, Titus talked about, or Paul did in his letter to Titus, in Titus 1 and verse 16. We'll pick it up here in verse 14, where Paul told Titus to beware of those who were not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men. Talking about commandments of God, but commandments of men that turn from the truth. Unto the pure all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure. Even their mind and conscience is defiled. They profess that they know God, but in works they deny Him, being abominable and disobedient, and unto every good work reprobate. They did not reflect the way of God and the truth of God in their actions. You know, over the years, there has always been tendencies of God's people to get off on tangents and to sort of pursue some thing that may not be of and by itself always something bad, but it is not something basic, it is not something fundamental. And many times it has been my experience over the years that those who were the furthest out on a tangent pursuing something of that nature were those who did not find the time to be focusing in on and practicing the basics in their lives. You know, prophecy is interesting and prophecy is important, but there are things that are more fundamental. And in fact, those fundamentals are necessary if we are to understand prophecy, because you see, the Apostle Paul, or not the Apostle Paul, but back in the book of Psalms, Psalm chapter 111, on down here in verse 10, we're told the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, a good understanding of all they that do His commandments. You see, the key to understanding, the first key to understanding, whether it's prophecy or any other aspect of Scripture, is obedience to the law. A good understanding of they that do His commandments. That's a starting point. We have to focus in on the basics. We have to get back to the basics. It's not wrong to have a variety of interests, but we must be on guard that we never become bored with the basics, because, brethren, the basics are something with which we must be always struggling and putting forth effort. Mr. Herbert Armstrong, in the last years of his life, I think you could easily say that in the last 7 years of his life, gave a focus to the people of God in what he referred to, what he termed, 3 mandates. 3 things that he emphasized over and over again. And I think these 3 things sum up the basics. In one sense, this was the last message that Mr. Armstrong gave. He gave it not just in one sermon, but he gave it continually, over and over, for the last 7 years of his life. And of course, people got bored hearing the same thing, right? Got bored hearing the same thing, and but you remember what they are? You remember the 3 things that he referred to as the 3 mandates that were necessary for God's people? 3 things that he kept stressing over and over in the last 7 years of his life. First one was come out of the world. Second was simplify your life, and the third was prepare to be teachers in the world to come. He emphasized those three things over and over. Now, he would go back to the beginning. He would go back to Genesis 1. He'd go back to the two trees in the Garden of Eden and the two ways of life. The way of accepting the truth of God, accepting the way of God's Holy Spirit, the way of God's law, as opposed to the way that is a mixture of good and evil. The way of experience and experiment. The way that seems right unto a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. He would go back and he would start and show how the world got off the track. He would pursue through. Sometimes he would deal with all the aspects of these. Many times he would focus in on just one. But over and over, there was a recurring theme in those last years that focused in on the importance of the fact that we must come out of the world, we needed to simplify our lives, and we need to prepare to be teachers. I want to go back and refocus our attention on these three, because we must never come to a point when we're bored with the basics. Brethren, we have to realize things go through certain phases. There is an excitement, there's an initial excitement anytime something is fresh and new. I think most of us, if we will look back to 2 years ago, we realize that a lot has happened in those 2 years. In some ways, almost a lifetime has happened in those 2 years. But you know, there was an excitement, there was a stir. And there were people who began to pray and study as they probably had not done in years. I know that was the case for many of you because you told me so. You know, there were things that were building, and we focused in, and we were focusing on what does the Bible say and what does God say, and spending time in prayer and Bible study. Events culminated over a period of months. And what now is the result? You know, there was a time of excitement, there was a time of enthusiasm. No place was too far to drive, no effort was too much to be spared to fill up anything. People were ready to be there. There was an excitement. There was a thrill. Well, you know, in one sense, nothing stays new. You know, you can be newly married. Boy, you're excited and you're looking forward to it, and the wedding day comes closer and closer, and the anticipation builds, and the wedding is there, and the honeymoon lies ahead, and there's all the excitement and all the thrill. But what happens? You know, a week goes by, a month goes by, a year goes by, 5 years goes by, 20 years goes by. You know, for some of us, 25 years goes by. For some, maybe 30 or 40 years go by. Talked to a couple of days ago. For them, 59 years has gone by since they were married. Mr. and Mrs. Trahan, by the way, over in Lafayette, they send greetings to all of you. And 59 years. You know, what happens as time goes by? Well, in a lot of cases, if people are simply addicted to the excitement and the thrill of something new, they never plumb the depths of what they have. You see, they're shallow and they're skimming along the surface and they're looking for some new thrill, for some new high. Sort of an excitement junkie. And they're looking always for some new thrill, for some new high. They never plumb the depths of where they are and what they have. And they never realize that there is a depth that can be known, can be understood. That's the way it is with the basics in terms of Christianity. We've got to plumb the depths of the basics. We've got to step back and to look at those things and to realize that the tendency all of us will have is to drift, to lose the intensity, to lose the excitement, to lose the zeal. Because we are in the flesh. We are physical. And spiritual things sort of wear down for us. In fact, other things wear down for us over a period of time. It's hard to be totally consistent in the flesh because the flesh is not consistent. So we have to go to God for that. Let's look a little bit at what Mr. Armstrong termed 3 mandates. Three things that are, let's say, requested or required. The first thing he emphasized was to come out of the world. Now, this is something that is taken directly from Revelation 18. Revelation 18, verse 1. John writes, "After these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of demons, and the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. All nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sins, that you receive not of her plagues. Her sins have reached unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Reward her even as she has rewarded you, and double unto her double, according to her works in the cup which she has filled to her double. Come out of her, my people." Now, Babylon is used certainly to symbolize this world system. Going all the way back to Genesis. You can go back to Genesis 10 and Genesis 11. Go back to read of Nimrod, that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Go back to read of the tower that where it was constructed there at Babel that was designed to reach up into the heavens. How God stepped down to confuse the languages and to scatter the people. The attempt to build one world the devil's way. The Babylonish system has been the term that God has used for this world civilization, this world society. This was the beginning of mankind's post-flood civilization. It stemmed from Babel. And man's religion, his economics, his political and military machines are an outgrowth of that system. When Nebuchadnezzar had his dreams, you can read there in Daniel 2 and also the visions that Daniel was given in Daniel 7 and elsewhere. The sequence started with Babylon, and it proceeded on down to the time ahead of us when the God of heaven will intervene and will set up a kingdom. Revelation talks about the final rising, the final coming together of Babylon the Great. Well, brethren, this world system is Babylonish. This world civilization, this world's religion, ultimately stems back to Babylonian paganism. You can even take popular holidays that are celebrated. We've just come through one. We're coming up on the next. I don't know how it was in your neighborhood. They didn't hardly get the Christmas tree out before they started putting up Mardi Gras decorations on some of the houses. And as soon as they get that down, we'll have Easter bunnies up, I'm sure. Things will get real boring for a while after Easter because they won't have anything to put up. But the point is, you look at some of those things, well, you don't have to do just a whole gob of research to find that these holidays didn't start with the New Testament. They certainly didn't start with Jesus Christ and the apostles. You can trace them all the way back to Babylon. You can trace them back to the Babylonian mystery religion that was the outgrowth of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. You can trace much of the religious symbolism, much of the religious, the trappings of religion in terms of holidays and various practices way, way back. This world society is called Babylon the Great. God's message to His people is to come out of the world. To come out of the world. That involves the whole aspect. That involves religion. It involves lifestyle and values. You know, we're told in the book of 1 John that all that is in the world, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. The world passes away, and he that fulfills the lust thereof. But he that does the will of God shall abide forever. Brought out back in the book of 1 John chapter 2, verses 15, 16, and 17. We're told not to love the world and the things of this world. Not talking about the people of the world. God loves the world in the sense of the people of the world. He gave His only begotten Son. But when He's talking about not loving the world, He's talking about the configuration of this society, not desiring to be part and parcel of a society that is built on the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life as the three underlying bases of this society and its ways. Back in the book of Leviticus. Let's notice in Leviticus chapter 11. Now, in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 1, the Eternal spoke unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which you shall eat among all the beasts that are on the earth. Now, this was not the beginning of clean and unclean meat. You can go all the way back to Genesis and find when God told Noah to put animals on the ark. He told him to take the unclean beasts by pairs and the clean animals by sevens. So, clean and unclean has been known and has been in force and effect from the beginning. You know, you go back and you read, Abel was a keeper of sheep. It didn't say he was a swineherd. There's a reason for that. So God is reiterating something that had been known from the beginning, but you can go through Leviticus 11 talking about the clean and the unclean and the various characteristics. Now, notice as we come on down, verse 43. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps, neither shall you make yourselves unclean with them, that you shall be defiled thereby. For I am the eternal your God. You shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, for I am the eternal that brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. This is the law of the beast and of the fowl and of every living thing that moves in the waters and of every creature that creeps upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. God says to His people, I want you to be like me. Be holy, for I am holy. Well, brethren, if we're going to be holy as God is holy, we've got to come out of the world. We have to understand the difference. We have to learn to distinguish between the clean and the unclean. And that's not talking simply about food. It is talking about food. But God gave a physical lesson, used an item of physical health. You know, God designed these creatures with totally different digestive systems. You can go through and do a study of how that the clean animals and the unclean animals have totally different digestive systems. And it's an interesting study, and you can go through all of these various things. You know, God knew what He was doing when He designed it. I remember years ago, in fact, it's been, I guess, close to 30 years ago, about 28 or 29 years ago, when a while after I had quit eating unclean foods, that the subject came up for discussion in my family and with my father, and he just couldn't understand why I'd been eating these things all along and all of a sudden just quit. And so I opened up the Bible and I showed him there in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 and said, well, this is why, because God says not to. Well, he thought about that, and he had me mark it there where it was, and I guess he read it and studied it and thought about it over the next week or two. And after he had spent some time going over that, reached the conclusion that that is what it said, and he quit eating it too. And so time went on, and I guess a couple of years later, while I was in college, he had a heart attack. And after the aftermath of that, he came back home, and the doctor had given him a list of things to avoid by way of foods. And he and I were talking, and he showed me the list, and he says, you know, the things that he tells me to avoid, those are the things that I quit eating. You know, back a couple of years ago. Those are the things I quit eating right here, these unclean foods. He says, why, why even the doctors can see that that's not good for you. And that impressed him in that way, that here God had said it years and years ago, centuries ago, from the beginning. God had established certain things, and here was a doctor coming along and saying, well, you know, that's not good for you. Well, of course it's not good for you. God didn't design it to be good for you. If somebody thinks it is good for you, then they don't understand the full picture. But the issue is not just a matter of food. You see, God wants us, verse 47, to make a difference between the clean and the unclean. Now, one thing that we do every day, virtually, other than fasting from time to time, but virtually every day we eat. So God gave something very physical, very mundane, something with which you're faced on a day-in, day-out basis, and He says every time you get ready to feed your body, I want you to have to think about making a distinction between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. Every time you get hungry, every time your stomach begins to grumble and growl, I want you to be faced with the decision of making a distinction between the clean and the unclean. It is to reiterate a spiritual lesson. You know, God could have given every animal the same digestive system. That wouldn't have been hard. Why would it have been hard to have given a horse the same digestive system as a cow? Or a dog and a cat and a pig and the same as a sheep and a deer and a goat. God could have made everything clean. He could have made the catfish just as clean as the speckled trout. God chose to make some fit to be eaten and others unfit to be eaten. He tells us that He wants us to think in terms of what we must accept and what we must reject. Because the principle is that we must be clean, we must be holy as the people of God. Well, brethren, as bad as it is to put into your mouth and into your digestive system that is unfit for food, I'm here to tell you it's even worse to put into your mind something that is unfit for thought. We ought to be at least as careful of what we feed our minds as we are what we feed our bodies. We're told over and over to come out of the world and the attraction that the world has held for God's people in Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18, verse 1, the Lord spoke unto Moses, speaking to the children of Israel and saying to them, I am the eternal your God, after the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein you dwelt, shall you not do. After the doings of the land of Canaan, wherein I bring you, shall you not do. Neither shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall do my judgments, keep my ordinance, to walk therein. I am the eternal your God. So God says, I don't want you looking to the world to get your ideas of how to do, how to be. He goes through and in chapter 18 here and deals with all sorts of sexual sins and immorality. And in verse 24 he said, defile not you yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it. The land itself vomits out her inhabitants. You shall keep my statutes and my judgments, not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation or any stranger that sojourns among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. Coming on down in chapter 19, verse 2, speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say unto them, you shall be holy, for I, the eternal, your God, am holy. Over and over, God emphasizes the contrast between His ways and the world's ways. Over in chapter 20, verse 7, sanctify yourselves therefore, and be you holy, for I am the eternal your God. You shall keep my statutes and do them. I am the Lord which does sanctify you. So he talks about a way of life. Brethren, we shouldn't be trying to get as close to the world as what we can get, sort of dabble our toe in the cesspool. Lean over the cliff to see how close we can get. There's always a tendency that continually besets the people of God from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation. That is to try to get up as close to the world as what we can get, to try to fit in, be like, be part of, to look like, think like, act like, blend in with this society which God labels Babylon, and He says, come out of her, my people. Mr. Armstrong emphasized over and over in the last 7 years of his life the importance of coming out of the world. Not fitting in with the world, not blending in with the world, not being part of the world. That was very basic. People get bored with the basics. It was very basic. Come out of the world. Oh, that's too harsh. That's too strict. I'll tell you what, you begin to sort of fuzz the edges a little bit. After a while, it gets harder and harder to tell where the world stops and the church starts. That was, go through. Didn't that happen to ancient Israel over and over and over again? They sort of looked over and saw what the Canaanites were doing. They looked back and saw what the Egyptians were doing. They looked and they thought, well, that's nice and this is a good idea. And they ceased to place value on what God valued. Our society does not value godliness. And it evidences ungodliness in all aspects. In terms of everything from business ethics to, styles that are immodest, to the wrong kinds of music, to the wrong kinds of entertainment, the whole gamut. Very basic to come out of the world. We have to look back in our lives and ask ourselves, coming out of the world is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process because, brethren, we've got a lot of the world in us. Every one of us do. We don't live in a vacuum. We're influenced by the society around us. You can't walk out of your home and not be bombarded with certain things, certain attitudes, certain ideas, certain ways. In fact, you can probably be bombarded with them in your home. All you got to do is turn on the radio, turn on the television, pick up a magazine. You can't just go through life, with your ears in your fingers and your hands over your eyes and just sort of go through life that way. It doesn't work. You run into the wall or fall down the steps or something. Certainly hate to see you driving down the road that way. But what do you see? Well, you got billboards, you got all sorts of things. What we have to do is realize that coming out of the world is an ongoing process. And we all have to step back and evaluate it in our own lives. We have to evaluate in our own lives. Am I coming further and further out of the world? Am I further out of the world than I was a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago? We should be. Am I further out of the world? Am I coming out more fully, more completely? Or have I sort of sidestepped my way back a little bit closer? Figured, well, this is not that big a deal. I don't know that that's so important. And so we sort of sidestep our way back in, and we compromise a little bit here. And, of course, compromise always starts out in what we consider minors, you see. People usually don't start out, and the first thing they do is, start working on the Sabbath and going back to eating unclean food. That's just the progression that comes at the end of a whole long line of compromises, starting in, quote, the little things. Well, Jesus said in Matthew 5, you remember what he said about the least points of the law? Let me refresh your memory in case we don't. Matthew chapter 5, verse 19, whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments, and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So coming out of the world is important. What about simplifying your life? Another way of saying simplify your life is saying put first things first. We are bombarded with things that are demands on our time. It seems like the more gadgets and gimmicks we have, the more electronic items, and we've got computers, and now it continually gets more sophisticated. I saw the other day, somebody showed me they had a little, it was not much bigger in size than a 3x5 card, and a little bit thicker than your finger. And it was a little miniature handheld computer that had the whole Bible on there. You could just call up any verse and just go through there, and you could find things, and it was very nice. It's amazing. It's amazing. Just a matter of a few years ago, something like that would have been way out of reason in terms of price and size. Any of you who were working remember some of the earlier computers they came in with. You could have filled up this room with something like that. It's absolutely incredible, but you know what we so often find? These are all supposed to be time-saving devices, right? Some of you that are older, think back. Do you have so much more time now than you used to have? It seems like to me that the more time-saving devices that have come out, the more people try to squeeze into a day. The more things there are to distract us. A lot of times, a lot of parents find themselves, particularly mothers, find themselves virtually running a taxi service. And, this one's got to go over here, and this one's got to go over there, and they're charging here and there, and taking this kid to that practice, and that kid to the other practice, and going here and going there. Life has come a long way since people sat out on the porch when it got dark and listened to the crickets chirp, looked at the stars, and somebody did a little whittling, and a few stories were told. Well, I'm not against all electronic devices and all. That's not the point. The point is, though, things that were designed to be our servants very easily can become our masters. And our lives get cluttered with so much that we lose the time, yet we got the same amount of time that every other human being who ever lived ever had, and that's 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week. But somehow we don't have time to do things that we really would say, well, that's important. I need to find time to pray and to study, and I want to spend time with my family and my husband, my wife, my children, and I need to do this and I need to do that. And we look at these things, and we look at things that we say, that's really important. But brethren, we all, I think, realize how easily we can find our lives so cluttered that what happens? The things that are most important are so often the ones that get squeezed out. We've got demands on the job, we've got demands here and demands there. Things get so hectic that what's really important in life can be completely squeezed out. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, very basic statement. He says, seek you first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. We've got to put first things first. We've got to have priorities. If we don't, all these things crowd in. People get tangled up with all sorts of financial commitments. Mr. Armstrong talked about that back at that time as he foresaw some of the squeeze that was coming on the nation economically, and we realized, and should realize, that there are a lot of things that are going to happen. It's not a time for people to just get stretched to the limit and obligate themselves in terms of their time and their finances in so many different directions that that the least little ripple sort of puts them underwater. Because there are a lot of big ripples and a lot of big waves that are coming in. So we emphasize the importance of simplify your life. Focus in on what's basic and what's important and simplify your life. Get down to the basics. That has to start spiritually. Because you see, it's only if you commit your ways unto the Lord that He will bring them to pass. If you don't simplify your life from a spiritual standpoint as a starting part, you'll never get there. And they sprung up because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. And others fell into good ground and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. So he went on down through these things, and finally he began to explain to the disciples what all of this meant. You see, they had asked him what it meant, and so that the birds gathered it up. This was sort of like those that it just, the truth, they heard the truth, but it went in one ear and out the other. It was like, the wicked one comes and catches it away, which was sown in his heart. It just doesn't take root at all. Then the stony places, these, in verse 20, hear the word, and with joy they receive it. They're all excited. It's a quick emotional response, but they have no root, no depth of root in themselves. They endure for a little while, and when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, by and by, they're offended. They don't last. As soon as they're under pressure and trouble and difficulty starts, they have no depth of root. Verse 22, he also that receives seed among the thorns is he that hears the word, and the care of this world, and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. Two things: the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches. Those are the things that can clutter your life. They can clutter your life to the point that godly fruit is not being born. We have to get back and examine what are our priorities. The cares of this life are not always things that are bad. We have obligations. We have responsibilities. We can have a variety of hobbies and interests. Some people really enjoy hunting. Others enjoy sports. People enjoy different things. Some may particularly enjoy whatever. It could be anything from music to sewing. It's not something that's bad or evil. There are job responsibilities. There are family responsibilities. There are things to do around the home. There are all sorts of cares of this life. The problem is not that those things are all bad and you shouldn't care anything about anything. It becomes a matter of priorities. The cares of this life can choke out. There's always something to do. You ever notice that? You never get... If you find yourself just totally finished and sort of sitting back and there's nothing else you can think of to do, I would like to talk with you because I'd like to get some real good advice in terms of how to do that. There's always things to do. There are always things that could be done. But you have to set priorities. You have to set priorities. The cares of this life and the deceitfulness of riches. You see, that's the other thing. Sometimes it's just a variety of cares and concerns, and this needs to be tended to, and that needs to be done, and I've got to take care of this with the kids, and this with my husband or my wife, and I've got this on the job, and the house needs this, and I've got to go here, and I've got to do that. The cares of this life. The other thing is the deceitfulness of riches. Some people get so caught up in the pursuit of money, in the making of money, and trying to accrue money, that they never have enough. They're always out chasing the dollar. The point is, there's If you sow seed, why does it get choked out with the grass and thorns and weeds? Well, there's only so much resources there available for the nourishment and the growth of that plant. There's only so much water. There's only so much nutrients in the soil. There's only so much sunshine. There's so much of this that is available. And if some of these quick-growing weeds come in and they are sucking up that moisture and those nutrients and are up grabbing the sunlight, sort of shading the little plant, then what happens? The plant never really grows. That our spiritual garden does not become overgrown. We have to prioritize. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're working on a job, whether you're in college, whatever your circumstance. We all have to prioritize, and we have to step back every so often and realize, you know, I may have overcommitted myself. I've got to look at what's most important. I've got to look at that, and if you can't find time to pray and study, if you can't find time to come to Bible study or Spokesman's Club or be involved in the things that are there, if all of that's being crowded out of your life, then you may ought to stop and look at your priorities. What are they? What are you doing that is so important? You know, if you get to the point that you can't find time for Bible study, Wheel of Fortune is just crowding all that out, and there's no time left, you may want to evaluate your priorities. You may have to simplify your life by pushing a button or pulling a plug. Well, that simplifies a lot of people's priorities. Now, you have to evaluate. There's nothing wrong with enjoying some fun or some entertainment or some diversion from time to time. I'm not condemning that, as long as it's not something that is bad in and of itself. It's not wrong to enjoy yourself or to have some fun or diversion, but we have to evaluate our priorities. If that's crowding out the things that are important and that are constructive. Some of the things that we may have to do to simplify our life, people may find themselves stretched so thin. Maybe they need to simplify their life economically. Maybe they are living to the limit. And maybe they need to pull back and realize that maybe some things they would be better off to forego and not to just spend every dime that comes their way to where they're always just pressured down. We all have priorities. We set those priorities. We have to look at those priorities, and we have to focus on simplifying our lives to where we make sure there is time for what is really important. That's important. To simplify our lives. We've got to come out of the world. What progress are we making? What about simplifying our lives? To what extent are we uncluttering, and to what extent are we piling on things that are making our lives more cluttered, more complicated, that are eating up our time, and we've got less and less time for what is really important? Well, we all have to evaluate our lives in that regard on an ongoing basis. A third point that was emphasized over and over again, Mr. Armstrong kept laying emphasis on it, had to do with preparing to be teachers. The world doesn't even understand, in terms of various Catholic and Protestant denominations, they don't understand really what salvation is all about. What are we being saved for? They don't understand the great plan and purpose of human life. You and I didn't either. We didn't understand until God called us and opened our minds to it, to realize that our destiny is to rule and reign with Jesus Christ on this earth. I remember when I first read Revelation 5:10. I remember it very vividly, and I remember being shocked because I had gone every Sunday for all those years, and I had this idea about going off to heaven. I didn't understand a whole lot about it, but I figured it was definitely preferable to the other place I'd heard about. It was, we'd say when we all get to heaven, and you'd hear about heaven and the pearly gates, and I didn't really know what I was going to do when I got there. I guess just sort of roll around heaven all day long. And I remember reading Revelation 5:10 that we've been made unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. And that was a shocking verse to me. Because number one, it didn't say we're going to heaven. It says we're going to be on the earth. We're going to reign on the earth. And number two, we have something to do. We're going to be kings and priests. Now, what does a king and a priest do? Well, so much of it focuses in on a way of life. Particularly, the aspect of the priest had to do greatly with teaching. One of the major responsibilities of the priest was to teach. Ezekiel 44:23 sums it up by saying, "And they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the profane, and cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean. And in controversy they shall stand in judgment, and they shall judge it according to my judgments. They shall keep my laws, my statutes, and all my assemblies. They shall hallow my Sabbaths." I'm going to teach my people the difference between the holy and the profane. Teach them to discern between the clean and the unclean. Brethren, you can't teach what you don't know. If you're going to have somebody teaching geometry in school, it's a good idea if they've already mastered geometry. You know, it's sort of bad if they're up there with sort of the book in one hand and they're trying to figure it out. You know, they're right along with the students. Well, they're going to have trouble teaching. You know, they may be able to read you what it says in the book, but if you ask them for an explanation or you ask them, well, how do you do this, or how would this apply here? Well, they don't know. No, if you've got somebody who's teaching something, you want them to know the subject. That's pretty important. That was the concept. And, of course, if priests were going to teach the people the difference, they had to know the difference. Back in Leviticus 10:10, where it talked about the priest, and after God had smitten Nadab and Abihu, and he tells Aaron here in Leviticus 10:10, that you may put difference between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean, that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken unto them by the hand of Moses. So you're to teach. You're to teach. You're to put a difference in your own life between the holy and the unholy, the clean and the unclean, and you're to teach God's way. Now, if we anticipate the time when we will rule and reign with Jesus Christ as kings and priests, then what we're looking forward to, what we're anticipating, is the time when we're going to teach the world. We're going to teach the world the ways of God. We've got to be preparing to be teachers right now. Now, we're going to teach the world to be holy. We're going to teach the world to be like God. You know, you might look at that there are really three different aspects that you could look at in terms of preparing to be teachers. If you're going to prepare to teach, you've got to know what is right. So you've got to know what is right from wrong. You've got to know that, but you also have to go a little further. You've got to know how to apply it in practical, everyday ways. And if you're going to teach others, then you're going to have to learn, we all are, how to resolve the conflicts that arise among human beings, which ties in with how to apply God's law. What's right? How do you know? How do you prepare to be a teacher? Well, you've got to learn what's right. You've got to go through and study the Word. You've got to study the Scriptures. You've got to study what God says. You've got to study God's law. You've got to study the way of God. The law is magnified by Jesus Christ. You've got to study the Bible. And study it in ways that focus in on what we're to do in terms of our husbands, our wives, our children, with other employees, with other church members, with all people with whom we come in contact with, everyone. Because the law, you see, tells us how to love God and how to love our neighbor. And we have to learn to apply these things in everyday practical situations. And that is very important. You see, it's not just enough to read the theoretical statement, thou shalt not steal. But then you get down to practical application in terms of your life, in terms of your job, in terms of the way that you interact with other people, how do you apply that law? What is the spirit of the law? What is the principle that Christ would have us understand and apply in our lives? Well, that's amplified elsewhere in the Scriptures. And inevitably, there are going to be conflicts and problems and things that come up between people. It's going to happen in the family. It's going to happen in the church. It's going to happen on the job. Because if you've got people together, everybody's not going to see everything the same way. I don't think that comes as any giant revelation. That's not new truth, is it? We all understand that. The problems of the world. The world is rent with conflict because people don't know how to resolve conflict in a godly way. People don't know how to resolve conflict in a godly way in the family. They don't know how to resolve it in terms of neighbors. They don't know how to resolve it in terms of nations. I'll tell you what, a lot of us don't know how to resolve conflict. People do a couple of different things. Some people, they think that what is involved is avoiding conflict at all costs. So something happens, or they get stirred up, or they get upset, or they don't like something, and they just withdraw and isolate themselves, sort of go over here in a corner. That doesn't resolve anything. That doesn't change anything. That only postpones the day of reckoning. It takes them out of playing a constructive role. It doesn't solve anything. Some people just get mad and fly into a rage. They don't get their way. It doesn't resolve anything. Oh, it may intimidate somebody for a little while into doing what they want them to do, but it doesn't resolve the problem. Sometimes people just stuff things. They try to deny that there's a problem. Oh, no, everything's okay, and they just stuff it, and finally one of these days they're ready to explode. Because they never dealt with it. They never faced it. All different things can come up. Some people are so afraid of conflict that they always are trying to in the middle, to just to take the brunt. They're trying to just prevent anything from happening or from getting out of hand. And so they're trying to just fix everything. They're ready to take the blame, and they're there to just try to smooth things over. That's not going to work. It doesn't work. The Scripture is very plain in terms of that. It tells us, Jesus said in Matthew 18, He talked about going to your brother. In Matthew 18:15, if your brother trespasses against you, if he does something to you, you go to him, Matthew 18:15, and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Now, very seldom do I see that practice. A lot of times what people do is they go around and they tell other people and they get their reinforcements. Tell everybody except the guy. Or they say, well, I'm not going to tell him, so they just stuff it. And they don't say anything to him, and it builds and it builds. And one of these days it just erupts, and then they start going back and giving him a litany of everything he's done for the last 6 years. And you did this, and I remember 5 years ago at the feast you said so and so, and boy, boom, here's the whole thing. Well, they told him all right, but they let it fester for about 10 years or 5 years or maybe just 1 year, and it just sort of festered and boiled. Sort of like setting something out, covering it up, and just letting it rot for a while. Well, it's pretty rank to deal with by that time. Now, how do you go to somebody? Galatians tells us. Galatians 6:1, brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Oh, so when you go to someone to tell him his fault, you don't go and say, you dirty, sorry, so-and-so, you did this, this, and this. I'd never do anything like that. So it says you go to restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. So you approach it in a meek way, considering yourself lest you also be tempted. You realize, you're going to be on the other end of this one of these times. So you better deal with somebody the way you want to be dealt with. You know, it's important. When you start talking about practical Christianity, when you start talking about the basics, if we're going to prepare to be teachers, if we're going to teach the world to be holy as God is holy and to dwell in harmony, then we'd better start learning it in our own lives by putting it into practice in our lives, in practical everyday circumstances, in our homes, in our families, in the church, in the neighborhood, and on our jobs, in every area and every aspect. Not letting the sun go down on our wrath, as it says in Ephesians. Let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. We can't afford to do that. We can't afford to, as he says in Ephesians 4:26, be you angry and sin not. There's time to get upset, to be angered at circumstances or at a situation, but don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Don't get bitter. Don't just build up a resentment toward someone. Deal with it. Deal with it. You don't deal with it by either flying into a rage or just isolating yourself, just sort of holding it all in, stuffing it all in, sort of going all sulking in a corner, just withdrawing yourself in a situation. There may be times when you have to withdraw yourself from someone because of their unwillingness to respond in any sort of way, but that's sort of a last resort. It's not the first resort. It's not the first thing you do to just sort of stuff all the feelings and deny that they're there. We've got to learn in our own lives, in living the Christian life, by exercising our senses to discern between good and evil, between what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. You see, we study the Word of God. We seek to apply it in our own lives. And that involves not just simply keeping the Sabbath and tithing. Yes, that's important. That's part of the law of God. But other things are part of the law of God too. In terms of the way we talk to one another, to encourage one another, to build one another, to learn how to handle life, to handle and relate to people. If we're given a responsibility, to learn how to exercise responsibility in a godly, loving way, not being overbearing and just bearing down on somebody and sort of grinding them down. All these things that happen on a day in and day out basis of just simply how to interact. We have to examine ourselves. We can't teach what we haven't learned. And we're told that we have to be renewed, as it says in Ephesians 4. That we have to be renewed, Ephesians 4:23, in the spirit of your mind. Put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. You put away the lie. You don't let the sun go down on your wrath. You don't give place to the devil. Verse 29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, of building up. Grieve not the Holy Spirit, whereby you're sealed until the day of redemption. Verse 31, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be you kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you. You see, that is the practical application of the law of God in our lives. We can't hold on to the spirit of murder. You hold on to a resentment and bitterness against someone, you're holding on to the spirit of murder. That's what it is. And it just sits and just festers. Now, we have to focus in on the basics. The basics have to do with how do we become like God. As we come out of the world, we simplify our lives and set our priorities, and we prepare to be teachers, realizing we've been called for a purpose. We haven't been called so we can just roll around heaven all day long. We're called to reign with Christ as kings and priests, to have a part in reconciling the world to Christ, pointing the world to God's way, and teaching God's way, and we've got to learn it and make it a part of us and a part of our thinking. It's important for all of us from time to time as we step back and we evaluate and we realize, brethren, Satan has different ways of getting to people. He has different ways of getting to us. Some people get so tangled up and confused that they don't know what the truth is. Now, Satan has really done his work there. That's sad. You know, he's the one that blinds the minds of people. The God of this world has blinded them. Talks about in 2 Corinthians 4. The people who become so confused and tangled up that they don't even know what the truth is. But brethren, that's not the only way Satan attacks. You see, we can give place to the devil, as it says right here, by letting the sun go down on our wrath. Satan can get to us through pride, through envy, through strife, through bitter feelings and hurt feelings, and just cause some of these things to just sort of stew and stir. Resentments build, hostility builds, and I'll guarantee you, if we let it build, the time will come when pressure will be put on and it will blow sky high. There are times of pressure coming. The very word tribulation means pressure. That's why many will be offended at that time, because they have things they've never dealt with in terms of the way they feel about other people, which is the spirit of the law. You know, thou shalt not murder. It's not, it say, well, you know, I only beat him half to death. He didn't die, so I didn't commit that sin. God ought to be satisfied, you know. I just beat him to a bloody nub, but man, the paramedics got there, and that guy, he's still alive. I didn't murder. God's after more than that. He don't expect him to look down and say, well done, good and faithful servant. He didn't die. You stopped just in time. I'm real proud of you. No, it's not enough. God wants us to get rid of the attitude in our heart and mind of realizing we can't harbor that spirit of retaliation and revenge and hurt. We've got to replace it with what it talks about here. Be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you. You know, we all stand in need of forgiveness, don't we? Well, if we need to be forgiven, we better be prepared to forgive. You see, if we're going to prepare to teach, we've got to prepare, we've got to learn the practical application of the way of God. Satan can get at people by confusing them about what the truth is. He can get to others through pride, through stirring up strife and envy that causes all sorts of animosities and resentments and hostilities and just a fracturing and scattering. Whether it takes place literally or whether it just takes place emotionally. We have to realize we do have an enemy walking about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. He didn't look over here and say, oh, well, you know, all those people meeting over there at Delta College, boy, those are people, they're really sincere about the truth. I certainly wouldn't want to bother any of them because they believe the truth. No. We have to understand that, brethren. Don't ever get bored with the basics. Don't ever think you're ready to leave the basics behind and you want to just hear and tell some new thing. Get off on the end of the twig somewhere. Oh, it's not wrong to have a wide variety of interests. It's not wrong to do a lot of things, but we can't afford to do things that are going to take us back into the world, that are going to clutter up our lives with a lot of useless clutter, and that are going to interfere with our really learning what we need to learn so that we can convey it to others when the time comes. It's very important that we focus on and renew and deepen, plumb the depth of the basics on an ongoing basis.